In 30 BC, the Roman civil wars ended abruptly. The ultimate victor of these conflicts was Octavian Caesar, who was bestowed the honorific title of Augustus by the Senate. He ushered in a new era of Roman hegemony and is widely considered to be the first emperor of Rome. Augustus Caesar, the ruler of the known world, began to set his sights on the last great frontier, Germania. The adoptive father of Augustus, Julius Caesar, had waged a war the generation before against the Gauls, who were located in the area of modern-day France. Over the course of these Gallic wars, Julius Caesar subjugated this entire area of land, and finally moved the Roman frontier to the Rhine. Julius Caesar expressed in his memoirs that the Rhine River was a natural boundary between Gaul and the Germanic tribes, and should remain the natural boundary for this new conquest. The Germanic people were barbaric and unruly, even more so than the Gauls. In his opinion, these people would never subject themselves to Roman law. Caesar said that extending Rome's border past the Rhine wasn't worth the gold or manpower to secure. During the time of Augustus, the Romans got to thinking maybe Julius Caesar was wrong. Perhaps the Rhine was a fine frontier for him after his conquest, but it wasn't Rome's final frontier. Following Julius Caesar's conquest, the area around the Rhine became a melting pot and trade flourished. The region began to prosper and generate wealth. The Romans became increasingly interested. The aggressive and more militaristic of the German tribes began to move away from the Rhine to avoid conflict with the superpower. The more friendly tribes, who were open to trade, gravitated towards this natural border. In fact, many of these tribes eventually became friends and allies of Rome. However, these were still Germanic tribes. Although those who had moved closer to the border were initially friendly, they were still highly independent and more aggressive in nature. These tribes were still sovereign political units. Individual tribes would have made their own alliances and would have routinely fought against or with one another. There were many divisions within the tribes and constant power struggles, which is not a surprise. This is much like the power struggles within any community. Additionally, Germans did not like to be ruled or have any sort of laws imposed on them that restricted their freedoms. There was an intense feeling of distrust towards anyone wanting to consolidate power. Germans did not have a hereditary line of leaders who came to power. They followed the strong. As a result, new leaders came to power often. Seeing the increased wealth of their neighbors across the Rhine, new leaders saw an opportunity. The once friendly tribes along the Rhine began to raid the empire. The Romans had attempted to civilize Germania peacefully through trade and cultural exchange, but this raiding of Roman wealth could not be tolerated. The Romans began to tighten their iron fist. The Roman plan would have to be long-term. The Romans knew if they were too eager, the Germans could unite against them. So carefully, Rome began to militarize the Rhine, building forts and military bases to help protect trade routes and to help prepare for future conquest. When the Romans were ready to strike, they did so with lightning precision, defeating and subjugating numerous Germanic tribes that had raided them in years prior. The Roman armies campaigned along the interior of Germania along tributaries between the Rhine River and the River Elbe. There is no evidence that the Romans crossed the Elbe, so it is commonly thought this was going to be their next border. One tributary, the River Lippe, contained a group of Germanic tribes known as the Cherusci. As the Romans began to spread their influence across the Rhine, they exploited the differences between tribes and even inside tribes such as the Cherusci. Let me explain. Rome would often use its military reputation to achieve its strategic goals. For example, Rome would consider the political landscape in Germania and then offer military assistance to settle tribal disputes. The tribes who befriended Rome would receive the benefit of having a rival destroyed, and Rome would have exerted little effort to do so. However, the benefactors were expected to be loyal to the Romans. That's where the internal struggle issues mentioned before come into play. In larger tribes, such as the Cherusci, there were clans, usually made up of the elite. Some of the clans became friends of the Romans, while other clans saw the Romans for what they were, foreign conquerors. The clans that befriended Rome received Rome's help in seizing control within the tribe. However, there was a catch. To ensure continued loyalty, the Romans demanded hostages from these allies. This would ensure the tribe's continued cooperation. The Cherusci chief at the time became an ally of Rome. He would send his eldest son Arminius as a hostage to the Romans. This Arminius will play a key role in shaping the future of what will become Germany. Arminius would spend the next several years of his life serving in the Roman military. We don't have any particulars of his service, but we know that he was well regarded and that he was raised to the equestrian rank. Because of his military ability with the legions, he was commissioned back to the Rhine to help with the overall Roman strategy in Germania and support the general in charge there, Publius Quintilius Varus. Varus was an aristocrat and friend of Augustus Caesar. Varus advanced well politically, but he earned a reputation for ruthlessness and cruelty. For example, while serving as the governor in Syria, he put down a rebellion in Jerusalem. To make an example of these rebels, he crucified 2,000 of them to ensure it would never happen again. As an interesting side note, this occupation and treatment of the Jewish people by Varus began mass popular protest against Roman rule. In this political climate, Jesus of Nazareth would be born. Roughly 10 years after serving as governor in Syria, Varus would be appointed to oversee the legionary functions in Germania. Varus's purpose was to cement Roman rule and start the process of creating a new province for Rome. The Romans laid the foundation for this new province by building rudimentary roads and bridges through the mountainous and forested terrain. Romans built roadways for two main purposes: troop movement and to help facilitate trade. Roads were an incredibly important aspect of Rome's projection of power, and you can even find original Roman roads to this day across Europe, a testament to their strategic importance both during the era of Rome and after. Despite the Roman superior military and their ability to quickly move from area to area, they were still incredibly outnumbered by the Germans. But the Romans had a special technique up their sleeves: divide et impera, or divide and conquer. The one thing Rome could not allow to happen was to have these tribes unite against them. This is part of the reason that Arminius grew to be such an important asset for Varus. He was a liaison to the other Germanic tribes. This gave Varus and the Romans some credibility and helped to forge some trust with the local chieftains. Despite Arminius' best efforts, it became evident that Varus overstepped his bounds in the eyes of many of the tribesmen. Varus did not come to this area to become an arbiter of Germanic justice. He came to rule them. While we don't know exactly what Varus did, it's safe to say that he didn't turn over a new leaf since his time in Jerusalem. Varus's campaigns in Germania were most likely a tyrannic affair for any tribe who got in his way. Although we are not too sure what exactly Arminius thought of Varus's actions, it may be during this time that Arminius became conflicted with what Varus was doing to his homeland and to his people. And then things hit a boiling point. As we said, Varus's intention was to lay the groundwork to create a Roman province. And how does Rome make money from provinces? Taxes. And this was Varus's greatest overreach. He started to institute taxes on the Germans under Roman influence, including those who were military allies, such as the Cherusci. This was a slap in the face. The Germans were aware of how much more powerful the Romans were, but still considered the relationship to be a partnership. The idea that they were a vassal was too much for this proud culture to stomach. The clan leaders who had supported Rome began to lose faith. The once strongly independent tribes began to unite against their common enemy. Despite their unity, one problem remained. How were they going to fight Rome? Their weapons would have been considered rudimentary compared to the Romans, who had iron swords, helmets, and heavy body armor. A fight against the Romans in the open field was suicide. They needed to use the same tactics the Romans had used on them. They needed someone who knew enough about the Romans to beat them at their own game. In the summer of 9 AD, Varus marched his legions out across the Rhine River, an estimated 20,000 Roman legionnaires. Although none of these Romans knew it at the time, most would never return across the Rhine. The Romans set up camp with their friends in the Cherusci territory, Arminius' homeland. That summer, the Romans continued on with business as usual, quelling rebellions, exacting tribute from their allies, and building roads. Meanwhile, behind Rome's back, the discontent grew. Sources say some of the legionnaires began to feel uneasy about their Germanic allies, who were acting strangely and looking at them weird. It was even suggested to Varus that he couldn't trust Arminius anymore. But Varus shrugged this off as your standard fireside chat paranoia. As summer turned to fall, Varus began to make preparations for his legions to return across the Rhine. Varus was then approached by his Germanic allies, who requested they be allowed to quarter a contingent of Roman soldiers for the winter. They said that when the Romans left for the winter, the new roads would no longer be protected and outlaws may roam the countryside. This would ruin Rome's trade networks. Varus jumped at this opportunity. Perhaps these barbarians were becoming Romanized after all. Varus left a sizable amount of his total army to stay with these Germanic tribes over the winter. Sources say that each tribe was granted around 500 men, and that he sent around 5,000 total. It would have been about a quarter of his army at the time, but Varus, at this point, had no reason to distrust the Germans. On their way back across the Rhine, Varus hears that some other Germanic tribes are stirring, and a revolt has sprung up in the north. This proved to be a bit of a conundrum for Varus. He needed to get across the Rhine before the onset of winter, but did not want to see all of his hard work undone by a rebellion. Compounded by this, the rebellion was occurring in a place that was not easily accessible. He needed to find a shortcut. Arminius convinces Varus that a shortcut does indeed exist. It's through Cherusci territory, the Teutoburg forest. Varus begins the march north via Arminius' shortcut. The travel, however, proved to be considerable for the Romans. Mud, bogs, overflowing creeks, downed trees, and mountainous ravines. This severely held up the Roman line. Through the dense forest of Arminius' homeland, the Romans would have found themselves surrounded by the furious elements of Mother Nature and Germania's natural protection. Arminius found a way to take leave of Varus' main army. His reason for leaving was to take a detachment of German mercenaries from the Roman lines to watch Varus' flank. Varus, believing his blind spots were covered, took little precaution in getting his army to their destination. The Roman line became more and more disorganized. The baggage train, where the supplies were kept, began to fall behind the main line of the army. It was a mess. And it was at this point, if the Roman historian Cassius Dio can be believed, that a torrential storm swept through the Teutoburg forest, soaking Varus' legions and creating an even more difficult task of trekking through the woods. Nevertheless, these were professionals. Varus' legions continued their trek, albeit in this disorganized, bumbling fashion, until they found themselves in a pass between a great bog in the north and a hill in the south. Any astute military observer may be able to look at this and say, this looks a little risky to cross. You're marching your army through a pinch point in which you don't have coverage above or below to make sure you aren't walking into an ambush. But let's not forget that Varus believed Arminius was watching his flank. He proceeded through this area with little precaution. From a position on the high ground in the south, tribesmen began to throw javelins and fire arrows into the Roman column. From the other side, sporadic attacks came from the bog. It appeared the rebellious Germanic tribes had found out about the Roman march and had sprung a trap. The Romans were not in a battle line and were unable to mount a counterattack up the hill. It soon became clear that the Germans on the high ground had a leader who appeared to have some experience in repelling a Roman charge. The tribesmen appeared to be everywhere. The Romans tried to mount a defense, but their force was too spread out. As a result, the Germans were able to pick off these smaller groups of Roman soldiers one by one. This was a dire situation for the Romans. If they didn't act, their entire force would quickly be carved up. Varus was able to hold off the Germans with enough of his army to allow the construction of a fort that they escaped into. However, not without a significant blow. Not only had they lost a sizable portion of their force, they also lost their baggage train. They were effectively cut off from their food supply. However, all hope was not lost for the Romans. First, it wasn't entirely clear how many Germans there were. Even with overwhelming numbers, the Romans had beaten the odds previously with superior weapons and tactics. Second, they believed if they could reach one of the roads they built, it would lead them out of the forest where they could see their enemy on open ground. It would also lead towards the Rhine and back towards civilization. Finally, they also considered they had allies nearby. Arminius and his group of German soldiers, Germanic tribal allies, and the 5,000 soldiers that were stationed with them. They just needed to somehow get a message to them. But the pieces of the puzzle began to become clearer to the Roman camp. The first mistake was made by Varus for sending out a quarter of his force to his Germanic allies. On a given day, the Germanic tribes housing the Roman soldiers rose up and slaughtered every one of the legionnaires. The second mistake was a much larger one, which was Varus trusting Arminius. The entire revolt in the north was aroused. Arminius had just needed a reason for them to march through the Teutoburg forest. Arminius then lured the Romans into a trap when he was supposed to be watching their flank. The Romans were ambushed, but worse yet, there was no hope for help coming. On the other side, seeing the way the wind was blowing, many Germanic tribes began to flock to their brethren in the woods. Without food and water supply, the Romans had no choice but to press on. Droves of lightly armored German soldiers would line distant tree lines, beckoning and taunting the Romans, and then killing the ones that got close enough. Even when the Romans reached a clearing, the Germans waited in the tree lines, beckoning them. When the Romans re-entered the forest, it was like going into a slaughterhouse. After 3 days of this, the Romans were finished. Varus and several of his leadership staff took their own lives. Many soldiers followed Varus's example. Others surrendered, and some tried desperately to escape. Sources state that the German tribes were not kind to their oppressors. In some cases, they lined them up and systematically killed the Romans. Those that weren't beheaded were burned alive in ritual sacrifice to the pagan gods. Some had the good fortune of being sold into slavery. The news of Varus's death and the destruction of the 3 legions sent shockwaves through Rome. A famous story from the day tells that Augustus, a man in his 70s by this point, was so distraught by the news that he would have episodes where he would just lose it, hitting his head against a wall and wailing, "Quintilis Varus, give me back my legions." The Germanic tribes coalesced into a loose confederation while they awaited the Roman response. Arminius and this loose confederation would lose almost every future conflict against the Romans, but left the Romans with too severe of casualties to press their victory. But the Germanic people didn't follow leaders who couldn't win. Arminius tried to continually consolidate power amongst the tribes, but his reputation from his victory at the Teutoburg forest diminished. To the Germanic tribes who followed strength, Arminius appeared to have lost his favor. He would soon be murdered by members of his own tribe who felt there was a need for a change in leadership. Rome, receiving a moral victory from killing Varus's great betrayer, began to suspend future campaigns. Tacitus, writing nearly a century later, summed up the career of Arminius well. Challenger of Rome, not in its infancy like the kings and commanders before him, but at the height of its power. He fought undecided battles and never lost a war. To this day, tribes sing of him. The Romans would never again take serious action to annex and create a province of Germania. Why not? Well, to put simply, Julius Caesar was absolutely right. He said that extending Rome's border past the Rhine wasn't worth the gold and manpower to secure. In his opinion, these people would never subject themselves to Roman law. The problem with Germania is that it's Germania and it's full of Germans. Germania has rough terrain and poor clay soil for farming. The Germanic people were unruly and hated the idea of being ruled by anyone. Arminius was murdered by his own tribe for trying to consolidate power. How could the Romans hope to consolidate power? The juice was simply not worth the squeeze. During the next few centuries, the Germanic tribes learned from Rome and Rome learned from them. But always, Germania retained its independence. The Roman Empire had found its new frontier. The empire, which had not stopped on the shores of the ocean, was checked at the banks of the Rhine.